Before this show came out, I made a video talking about all the different remakes and remasters that were coming out that definitely didn't need to come out, and it was spurred on by The Last of Us Part 1 being remade. Now, the show is also technically a remake. It's just remade in a different medium, but this time, I'm not mad at it. Let's talk about it. The Last of Us is a story-driven game, and I think the only reason it's gotten as big as it has is because of that, especially when the gameplay is mediocre at best and doesn't stand out in the many third-person shooters. But, this is about the show, so I'm gonna stick with that. If you haven't played the game, or better yet, watched the Let's Play, spoilers, and I guess spoilers for the show too. The story is, thankfully, largely the exact same, and I think it's better off for it. Let's start with the positives, because there's way more of those. Even though the show is largely the same, there's some changes that I really liked in this version. I'm really glad that they extended the intro and showed Sarah and Joel's relationship a little bit more in depth. I think it gives better context to how he looks at Ellie later. Bill's backstory was great. I was happy to see Nick Offerman in Home Depot again. That was cool. I think the actual story that he was in, though, was really well done and actually would have fit nicely in what I wish this show would have been, but we'll get into that later. The love story was really sweet and tender, and I like that it wasn't all happy and rainbows. It was a real relationship between two men that found love, but weren't the best at loving each other. If you couldn't get behind that, you're either really homophobic or not capable of thought. Take your pick. The overall backstory, from the outbreak to Ellie and Marlene's relationship to even slight changes to characters that I'll bring up later, I think the world building was handled really well, and honestly a little bit better than the game did, but that's just because the focus is a little wider in this adaptation. The wound/winter section of the story is also done much better in the show, since it's taken care of relatively quickly instead of over weeks, since the game makes a note that the seasons change and David says that a few weeks ago Joel killed his men. I mean, it's still unbelievable that Joel came back from the brink of death with nothing more than some penicillin, but I know better than to say something bad about The Last of Us on the internet. The gameplay is mediocre at best and doesn't stand out in the many third-person shooters. Well, again, I guess. The show also changes the circumstances around Henry and Sam, and I honestly enjoyed this version of them much better. There's no anger towards Joel on Henry's part, which felt dumb to me in the game, and Ellie knowing about Sam being bitten and then trying to use her blood to save him was such a great touch. The show keeps the both Fedra and Firefly suck angle, and I'm glad they did. The Last of Us doesn't have any heroes, and everyone is wrong in one way or another, and the show maintains that. Media literacy is dead. You'll see when season 2 happens if you're not aware, so I'm sure there's people who don't and won't get it, but like a bunch of other zombie stories, the point is that humans are complicated and fuck up way more than they do anything right, but there's an endurance to people that shines through. I also really like how the show carries the point from part 2 about the cycles of violence. The show makes sure that we see the people that Joel hurts, specifically David's people, and see how depressed and demoralized they are, so you know that when Joel fucks them up, they're actually people. But in the game, you don't see the other groups. You don't see them as people. They just turn into other enemies to kill. David is positioned as the villain, but realistically how he and Joel impact others' lives are very similar because they're both selfish people, acting under the guise of protection to kill, even though David is worse in that regard. Bro even has more food than everybody else for no reason other than he's just a dickhead. But you get what I mean. And since, like I said, the story is mostly unchanged, it's still a very good story. As much as I like to make fun of The Last of Us and its fans, I do really like this world and its characters, and the show does a great job of capturing what made these characters interesting in the first place, while even expanding on some. It's even kind of paced similarly, with the show being like 80% talking and 20% action. For the things I didn't like, it's really only one, and her name is Kathleen. But wait, before you type away, this is going to be a little bit more nuanced than, she's just a weak woman who no one would listen to. I usually don't even look up what people are saying about a show or movie before reviewing it, because 1, I don't want something to cloud my initial thoughts, and 2, I rarely see anything that I would consider constructive criticism anyway. But I felt like there were massive parts of her character that were missing and wanted to see if I was bugging or not. And turns out that Kathleen is a very polarizing character. But one of the major defending points for her that I've seen is that the criticisms are misogynistic and wouldn't be there if she were a man instead. Now, I get where these people are coming from, especially when that's a big issue whenever there's a woman just existing, and even more especially when the unwashed gamers have something to say. But for me, I don't really think that's true here. Now, I have nothing against Melanie Lynskey as an actress, since I've never seen her in anything, and I don't want my criticism to be an attack on her, because it's not like she completely wrote the character and decided on everything she did. I also do try to keep my biases in check, or at least make them known so if I am actually bugged the fuck out about something, I can be told to chill out. But if, for an example, an unassuming man like Tom Hanks or something played a soft-spoken, unaggressive, non-typical masculine leader and was out for revenge for his dead wife or sister or something and did all of the exact same things, I would say he's still a bad character. To me, it feels like they set her up as a foil to Joel in a similar way that David is, because it shows how selfish acts can bring you and those around you down, and that through line can carry through to part 2, where Ellie essentially does the same thing. But in her case, 1, she's not forcing anyone or using her power and status to make others follow her, and 2, I think the only reason that story works as well as it does is because you already know the characters involved. But let's play devil's advocate. You could argue that she is smart because she's leveraging the resistance to search for Henry and Sam. It could also be that she's a person who fell into the leadership position, although that doesn't make sense because we've never shown why someone would actually follow her. But maybe that is the case and she's just using her new position for personal gain. But these are things you have to extrapolate from your own thoughts or something someone said in a podcast. David, for example, was a preacher and gathered a flock that would listen to him solely because of that. We're not even told that Kathleen was a high-ranking member of the resistance who took over for her brother. It just happens. She's supposed to be the leader of the resistance in Kansas City after her brother died, and whoever this guy is makes the point to say she's the reason they were able to take Kansas City from Fedra. But how? From what the show gives you, I still don't think Kathleen is a good character, but don't get me wrong, good characters can do bad things and be bad people. Joel is a perfect example of that, but Kathleen only does bad things, and we're just told of some good without even being told how. I think the bedroom scene could have been written better to show how she doesn't really even want to be a leader, and she's struggling with that, the pain between losing her brother, her anger at Henry, and the stresses of running an entire city now would have gone a long way to make her character feel more well-rounded and would give more credence to the idea that this isn't actually something she wants to do and is just weighed down by everything. Or showing off more of her backstory and her relationship with the brother that apparently everyone loved, and we can see how her descent and revenge may have also helped to define her character. But between her making everyone search for Sam and Henry when there's other pressing issues, killing what seemed to be the only doctor, and not having really any memorable moments aside from bad ones, like when she said her brother told her that this room is like a box. Yes, every room is like a box. Or the ending where she's talking to Henry and saying, kids die like all the time. It just comes off very hypocritical and not in a way that reveals anything about the character, aside from her having zero empathy and awareness, which we already saw earlier. There's aspects of her characterization that I think could have worked well, but I think there's more that outright just suck or feel underbaked, and she just falls flat, especially when you look at all the other characters she's surrounded by. I think grief is powerful and drives people overboard, but for me, there's just so much missing from her character for any of that to resonate, especially if you're going to be a major antagonist. I think switching Henry to be a snitch to protect Sam works really well because it's something that Joel would do for Ellie, so I get why they went that route, but Kathleen just was not it for me. But we've talked enough about that, this isn't even a quick hit anymore, so let's talk about the characters and actors. Even with what I just said about Kathleen for like 5 minutes, I still do think everyone did a great job with their performance, especially Kathleen, because I didn't like her, and you're not supposed to, so she did a great job. Pedro Pascal, or
Cool Slutty Daddy,
if you're nasty, as Joel has the gruff, standoffish but loving father stick down. I do think he goes back and forth between having an accent and then just speaking without it, but he does that with his own name, so whatever. It's not enough to diminish his performance, especially in the first episode, anytime he's talking to Ellie about his past, or those final 2 episodes. Bella Ramsey fucking killed her performance for Ellie, and I'm really excited to see how she takes on the next season since it is fucking heavy. But in every situation she's in this season, you feel it, man. In the beginning, when she's still got that twinkle in her eye, she's funny. She really does seem like a kid, and I thought she was younger, but she's 19, so that means her acting was even better than I thought. Throughout the season, I thought she did great, but starting from the Left Behind episode on, it's like she flipped a switch, and part of that is just because the story gets darker and she reflects that. But man, in that last episode when she's being distant to Joel, you feel how uneasy she feels, and it sucks, but she's great in the show. I've never seen her anything else, but I'm really excited to see what she does next. I like Anna Torv as Tess more than I actually like the game's Tess, but I'm not sure if that's just because we get a little more backstory in the Bill episode or just the performance itself, but I really liked her, and I liked her sacrifice more in the show too. I didn't like old boy putting his mouth on her like that, because that was Very strange, but the explosion was cool. Gabriel Luna as Tommy was cool, just like the game. He kind of doesn't do too much for me to care about, but I did like how he played off of Joel. Nick Offerman as Bill was probably my second favorite performance after Bella, even though he's only in one episode. But the range that he goes through from meeting Frank to finding love to losing him was genuinely some of the best acting I've seen in a while. Scott Shepherd as David really knows how to play a freak. He did a good job, but something about him we don't know. And the last person in the good section that I want to talk about is Lamar Johnson, who played Henry, and I really want to talk about the very last scene before he redacted. Up until that point, because we actually got to see Henry and Sam together before meeting Ellie and Joel, they have the most emotionally interesting relationship, I guess is how I would put it. And because they changed it from Henry being angry at Joel to feeling shock and remorse, Lamar in that little moment conveys so many emotions perfectly. So shout out bro, that's really all I gotta say. Shout out you. But now let's talk about how good this show is as an adaptation. I've been pretty anti shot for shot adaptation for a while, because if you're just remaking something in a different medium with the exact same story beat by beat, what's the point? Just go engage with the original, and I still stand by that. If you're going to do an adaptation, it should be different. At the beginning of the video, I talked about what I wish this show was, and that's an anthology. Bill and Frank's episode feels completely different to the rest of the show, and while it was very good storytelling, it felt like it should have been standalone. I wanted this to be an anthology because one, I already knew the story and didn't really care to watch it again, and two, I think more of these types of adaptations would work better as anthologies because you can just focus on the world building itself rather than making sure you're hitting all the key points. It's just more freeing from a storytelling perspective, and I think it would be far more interesting that way. There's so much of the world that we haven't seen. We haven't seen anything that's not in America, and I think doing that in an anthology would be really cool. Even Henry and Sam's storyline, I think, would have been more interesting as a standalone episode, because then you don't need Kathleen to be a reflection or foil. She isn't being compared to anything else. She still sucked, but it would work better. But the difference that I noticed from watching this show is that when adapting games to movies or shows, since it removes the only thing that makes it any different from those mediums, the gameplay, it changes how that story actually feels. What I mean is that when you're just watching something, you are helpless. There's nothing you can do to impact what you're seeing on screen, unless it's like American Idol and you call in. I don't even know if they still do that, but you know what I mean. In a game, even when you're in a cutscene, you have the mentality of, how am I gonna get out of this situation, rather than how are the characters. For this show in particular, I think that does two things. One, it heightens certain moments, like between David and Ellie, because you can't do anything, and because they made the scene much worse. And two, it gets rid of the cognitive dissonance that comes from a story about how violence is wrong when you spend the whole game doing unspeakable violence. I think that this is going to be more important for the next season, but without that disconnect between the story and the gameplay, I wonder how that will impact how you look at the stories themselves. I doubt that it'll change how I feel personally. I'm pretty set on the Joel is wrong camp, but who knows. As an adaptation, I'm glad that it gave me something that the game didn't in many ways, which makes it feel less like rewatching something you've seen before and more like a director's cut. I think the show is great if you haven't seen or played the game, but I think even if you have, there are some moments that not only work better in the show, but there's some moments the show makes up that I wish the game had. Prayers up to whoever plays Abby in season 2 though, because it will be very stressful for them one way or another. But what did you think? Let me know in the comment section below. I will joke you if you actually me in the comments. Do all the YouTube things before you go, and thanks for watching.